So this is going to be a long video. I finally managed to paint the FW-190 and I also made some earrings for my girlfriend out of FW-190 spare parts from the kit. Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. In this video I will show you how I painted the FW-190 I built and modified in the last video. Right after I was finished filming the last video, I took the model and broke it down into sub-assemblies for easier painting. I then started out with a couple of coats of Black Mister Surfacer 1500 as a primer and as a nice dark base coat. It seems to me that most aircraft modelers use a pre-shading approach for their painting, but since I normally do armor, I'm way more familiar with post-shading, and this is what I did here as well. I got myself an AK Interactive Real Colors paint set for German aircraft that included most of the paints I needed for this project. I started out with RLM76 for the undersides of the wing and the fuselage. I thinned my paint pretty heavy to build the paint job up in layers. I tried to use the panel lines as a guide structure for my painting. I made the panels lighter in the middle and darker on the outside. When I felt I got too much of a checkerboard look, I took some very thin paint and sprayed it all over to smooth it out and blend everything together a little more. It wasn't necessary to add any white paint to the RLM76 to make it lighter. After a couple of coats I got some pretty nice and bright highlights. But I sprayed a lot of layers to get the result I imagined. It took me about 4 hours to paint the undersides of the wing and the fuselage. Then it was time for RLM02. This paint is sort of a greenish grey and was used on all the internal parts of the aircraft, so on the inside of the motor panels, on the motor mount itself, on the firewall, in the landing gear bay, and also on the area where the fuselage sits on top of the wing. Again, I used thin paint and built up everything layer by layer. After a couple of coats I added some Tamiya Deck 10 into my RLM02 paint to get an even brighter highlight. If you ever wondered, it's totally fine to mix Tamiya acrylics and AK Interactive Real Colors together. They mix fine without any issues. After a couple of coats I also started adding Tamiya white to this mixture to get even brighter highlights on some parts. As you can see, I also painted all the engine panels that I didn't need for my model. At first I had the idea to place them in the diorama, but then I found out that I didn't need them for that. This is where the idea came from to convert them to earrings for my girlfriend. I also should have started with the RLM02 instead of the RLM76. After I finished painting the landing gear base, I had to reapply RLM76 to the areas around, since they got a little overspray on them. And then it was time for another grey color, in this case RLM75 for the upper sides of the fuselage and the wing. Here I used the same techniques I already employed on the underside. I used the panel lines as a guide and tried to make the panels lighter in the middle and darker on the edges. As you can see, I painted the aircraft panel by panel. This way there's a little difference in each of them, and I feel like I get a more natural look this way. And again, if you feel like there's too much of a difference between two panels sitting next to each other, that's not that big of a deal. Take very thin paint and spray it over both of them to blend them a little more together. And after a couple of coats of RLM75, I started to add Deck 10 into my paint to get even brighter highlights. At this point I also started to increase the thinner to paint ratio, as you can see here. My paint comes from the airbrush pretty wet but dries so fast because the thinner evaporates so quick. At this point my paint became so thin that it's more or less a filter rather than opaque paint. At this point the surface details like the rivets and the panel lines started to become visible. I also was quite happy when I noticed that the seam where I closed off the fuselage in the last video with some styrene sheet was nearly invisible. After I was finished with the RLM75 on the fuselage sides, I reapplied a couple of coats of RLM76 to blend them nicely together. Then it was time to paint the camo pattern using the RLM74 paint. I'm not the biggest fan of hard-edged camo paint jobs, so I did this freehand without any masking. Then I roughly sketched in the camo pattern. I like to make it a little smaller at first than my reference shows. This way I can clean up the edges after I filled the area with the right paint. Remember that I said in the beginning that pre-shading is not really my cup of tea? Well, this is mostly what I did here. I tried to preserve the highlights and shadows I did while painting the RLM75 layer underneath. But I of course added some post-shading afterwards. After one of the last videos I got asked which airbrush I use. I heavily rely on my Harder and Steenbeck Evolution and Infinity series airbrushes. For priming and clear coat I normally use a 0.4mm nozzle, and for everything else I use my 0.15mm nozzle, since it gives me the fine spray patterns I'm looking for. Let's also do the other side of the wing camo. Again, I used my airbrush to roughly sketch in the pattern, and then I started to fill it in. Sadly I wasn't able to preserve the contrast as much as I wanted, since the RLM74 paint is quite dark, but we're going to fix this in a minute. I'm quite sure I said this before, I like to go for a stark contrast in my models. Weathering usually tones down the contrast a lot, so I like to overdo it a little in the beginning. Let's get back to the fuselage. There are no big green shapes like on the wing. The green paint is mostly concentrated around the canopy. Also, according to my reference pictures, the edge between the green and the grey paint on the fuselage is a lot softer than it is on the wing. At this point I almost forgot to do the camo pattern on the horizontal stabilizer, and luckily I noticed that before I started to mix in any other paint into the RLM74. After I finished the horizontal stabilizer, it was time for more post shading. Again I added some Tamiya deck tan into my RLM74 paint and used the panel lines as a guide for my painting. As I did before, at first I used the larger panels as a guide. Then I tried to get in real close and focused my paint in all those small areas between the rivets. And of course, I did this with many thin layers. I really started to like the contrast at this point. What I didn't like so much was the grey look or the green areas on the wing. They started to look quite similar to the grey areas around it. But luckily there's a fix for that. I brought out one of my all-time favorite paints, Protective 4BO by AK Interactive. And this is normally used for Soviet World War II tanks, but it did a great job here. I thinned it quite heavily so I could spray it as a filter over all the green camo areas. And this was a great solution. I was able to keep the contrast, but I also got a lot more saturation in the green tones, and I liked the look a lot. This paint also helped me to soften the edge between the RLM74 and 75 on the fuselage a little more. My reference pictures also show that there's some mottling between the edge of the RLM74 and 75 on the fuselage. I used my lightened up version of RLM74 and also the Protective 4BO to paint this pattern. I didn't use any pure RLM74 since it looked way too dark for my taste. And again my high thinner to paint ratio came in handy. When I made a small mistake I was able to paint right over it without worrying too much about it. It also came in quite handy that I painted the plane in so many sub-assemblies. There was no cockpit inside, so I didn't need to worry about masking, and I was able to stick a sponge into the fuselage and put a wooden stick into that, so I got myself a nice painting handle. Then I started to paint the rudder. The rudder received a grey instead of a black primer. It will be yellow in the end, and painting yellow over a black surface is quite a challenge. It also received a light pre-shading with Mr. Surface Mahogany. Yellow isn't the best paint to post-shade it, so this was the simpler approach for me. Then the rudder received a lot of thin coats of RLM04. Then it was time for some masking. All the control surfaces have a little red tab at the trailing edge, so I taped this off and painted that red on all of them. After that it was time for even more masking on the canopy. I could have just ordered pre-cut mask for this model, but I was impatient, so I did this on my own. I used my favorite Tamiya masking tape to mask off the whole area. Then I used a wooden toothpick to push down the edges and a scalpel blade to cut around the edge. After that I was able to pull the excess off. This was easier than imagined, and it was also a lot faster than ordering pre-cut masks from the internet. Then it was time for another one of those RLM paints, in this case RLM-66. If you ever wondered, RLM stands for Reichsluftfahrtministerium, and that's way easier to pronounce for me than RLM, but I will stick to the RLM. RLM-66 is the interior color for the cockpit, so I painted this first on the canopy, so the canopy will have the right color from the inside. I then went over it with a couple of coats of RLM-74. And of course, the canopy received the same post shading with the same colors as the RLM-74 on the wing and the fuselage, so everything will look similar. I think it really became clear in the past that I'm not the biggest fan of masking, but pulling off the masking tape is one of the most satisfying processes in the whole build, so this was quite fun. And guess what? After I was finished pulling all the masking tape off, I started adding more masking tape to the canopy. There's a small antenna mount in the middle of the canopy. To make my life a little bit easier, I used a cutting plotter to cut the right shape into a piece of masking tape and cover the area around it. After everything was covered up again, I went back in with RLM-76 and then RLM-74, and of course I also did some post shading to that area. After that I also glued in the inner structure with the headrest. This was painted before in RLM-66. I used my AK Interactive Crystal Magic Glue for that, so I don't fog up the canopy with super glue. Then it was time for some pinwash action. I used my AK Interactive Black Panel Liner to pronounce the rivets that are molded onto the canopy. After the pinwash dried for a couple of minutes, I used AK Odorless Thinner and a brush to brush the excess off, so the paint stays in the recesses and I get nice and pronounced rivets. And then it came to the decals. I already told you in the railway car videos that I'm not that familiar with decals, but this model had a lot of them, even more than the railway car I did in my first video. I really took my time with those to make sure I get everything right and that they will look nice in the end. I cut them out and placed them on a piece of wet paper towel until they became loose from the backing paper. After that I wetted the area with my brush where the decal would sit later and pushed the decal into place. When the decal was in place, I used a dry brush to soak up the excess water on the decal. When the decal was dry and in the right place, I applied some VMS decal softener over the decal. I made sure to keep it only on the decal and not hit the surrounding paint with it. In the past I had some problems with my VMS decal softener softening up the paint around the decal, so I was quite careful this time. Also, when I got some decal softener on the paint, I used some clean water to thin it down. This seems to be the right way to do it. After a couple of minutes I used a wet cotton bud to push the decal down to the surface. I have to say I'm quite happy with the job I did on the decals. There's no silvering, no air trapped under them, and also the borders are nearly invisible. This was one of the steps that took a lot of time, since there were quite a lot of decals. At some point in the future I would like to build maybe a modern jet, and I'm really not looking forward to add like 1,000 no-step decals all over my paint job. After all these small decals went down fine, I started to work on the larger decals on the wing. Sadly, this is where I made a big mistake. After I applied the decal softener and pushed the decal into place, I noticed a small air bubble under the decal. I tried to remove it, and while I tried to remove it, I sadly damaged the decal. I decided to replace the whole decal, since there were some spare ones in the kit. I decided that I would try to remove the decal with a lot of water and scrubbing it with my brush. For some reason, only one half of the decal got loose again, and then I was stuck with half of a iron cross on the underside of my wing. Then I tried using my decal softener to soften up the rest of the decal and remove it. While doing that, I did some pretty heavy damage to the paint job. But as you can see, with my painting technique, it's not that big of a problem. I was able to paint right over it, and after that I applied the new decal without any problems. I'm quite sure that if you don't know about this mistake, you won't notice it in the end result. Even I had a pretty hard time to spot it in the end. After all the decals were applied, I sealed them with a nice coat of AK Interactive Ultra Matte Varnish. Let's start working on the canopy. Again, black primer, and then I sprayed everything with RLM66. This is almost like a German grey, so if you are not able to get any RLM66 paint, German grey is almost a perfect fit for that. Right after the first coat of RLM66, I started to add some Tamiya flat white into my RLM66 paint to start the post-shading process. After the post-shading was done, I started to work with the Quinta Studios 3D Cockpit decals. I cut them out like normal decals and also placed them on a wet paper towel. After they got loose from the backing paper, I applied some wood glue to the cockpit parts that I sanded smooth in the video before, and then put the decals right into place. Honestly, using those decals feels almost like cheating. They fit right into place and they look so good. Painting the original cockpit detail to a similar level would be so much work. As I said, I used fast-drying wood glue instead of super glue to glue them into place. This gives me some time to move them into place and shift them around. The seatbelts that are included in the 3D decal set are made from a few different pieces. I glued them together while they were still stuck to the backing paper, so it was a little easier to hold everything in place. Another advantage of the wood glue is also that it dries almost crystal clear, so you won't spot any excess. Then it was time to start the weathering process. I started out with 2 rounds of black pin wash made by AK Interactive on the cockpit pieces. I applied the paint around the details, let it dry for a few minutes, and then I came back in with my brush, dipped in AK odorless thinner, and blended everything together. I also like to keep a paper towel at hand during the blending process. If there's too much paint on my brush, I just wick it off on there. Pin washes are one of my favorite weathering techniques. They are quite easy to pull off and they add a lot to the model. It's, in my opinion, the easiest way to make all those small details pop. Since the enamel paint is also easy to remove with the right thinner without damaging your acrylic base paint, it's quite easy to fix any mistakes you make during that process. After 2 rounds of black panel liner, I started to use AK Interactive Streaking Grime to get a few more natural tones on there. Aircraft cockpits normally don't get that dirty. So I used my thinner again and removed most of it, so there's just a hint of streaking grime around all these small details like the rivets for example. I also like to use enamel thinner to thin down my streaking grime before I apply it, so I can build it up again layer by layer. Now it's time for some brush painting for all those small cockpit details. I use mostly AK Interactive 3rd generation acrylics for that. I painted all the small details according to reference photos I found on the internet. Since the cockpit will be mostly in shadow, I again opted for a lot of contrast and edge highlighted a few of the details, so they will be still visible after the cockpit is placed in the fuselage. I used AK Interactive Grey Blue to introduce a few highlights to the dark grey RLM66 parts. That worked pretty well. There's a small red button on the control stick, and since I just got some interactive real color markers, I used the signal red one to paint this little knob. I heard a lot of good things about those, and for small details like this knob for example, they are in my opinion the perfect solution. But I don't want to paint anything larger with them. One of you guys mentioned in the comments under the last video that there are a lot of small rivets for me to highlight one by one, and of course that's what I did. At this point I started to use AK Interactive 3rd Gen Acrylic Grey Blue to highlight all the small rivets one by one, piece by piece. Of course you could just dry brush all those details, but I feel like doing them individually one by one gives you a cleaner result that I like pretty much. But to be honest, I felt a little stupid at the end when I noticed that all the rivets I highlighted at the bottom of the cockpit aren't visible in the end like at all. After most of the highlighting was done, I added the last few details like the rudder pedals. The straps on the rudder pedals also came from the 3D decal set and look pretty great. Then it was time for some chipping, and I used Vallejo metal color for that. Those paints normally are used for the airbrush, but you can brush paint them without any issues. I really like those paints since they stay wet quite a long time, even in a tiny brush like this one, and I started to paint all those chips one by one. Sponge chipping also would have been an option, but I feel like painting them individually is also way more controlled. I used the chipping effects also as a highlight for a few pieces. I apply a heavy, light aluminum chipping around hard edges and saw these edges become clearly visible in the end. This was especially important in the cockpit to show all those lovely details so that border models included and that I enhanced by using the 3D decals by Quinta Studios. At some point I felt like I overdid the chipping a little bit, but in the end that's fine for me. Overall, the story will be when the aircraft and the dioramas finished, something around the topic of a heavily beaten up aircraft going back to the factory for maintenance or rebuilding, so I think it's fine to add a little more chipping. After the chipping was finished, I went back to my enamel effects, in this case AK interactive dust effects. I dabbed a few drops of paint in some random places and then went right in with my brush dipped in thinner to blend it over the surface. Sadly, I had to stay away from my beloved rust effects. Since this is an aircraft made of aluminium, there's no need for any rust effects, especially not in the cockpit. And then it was finally time to assemble the cockpit. I glued in the instrument panel using super glue, and I also glued in the piece where the engine attaches and the machine gun mount sit on top. After the pieces were dry, I was able to slide the whole cockpit assembly into the fuselage. This was a lot easier than painting the cockpit while building the aircraft and put it in before you glue the fuselage shafts together, but I guess it only works if you build a model like I did in this video. And the fit of the cockpit in the fuselage was so perfect that I didn't need to apply any glue to hold it in place. So even now, after everything's finished, if I wanted to, I could just remove the cockpit from the whole fuselage assembly. Then I painted a few of the leather details, like the cushion around the instrument panel area and also the cushion on the headrest that's already mounted in the canopy. I base coated everything with a dark brown and then stippled some beige and red-brown paints over it. At this point I also glued the last details, like the crank that's used to open the canopy or this little red tab. For some reason I also forgot to add the throttle lever earlier and I had quite a hard time to put it into place at this point, but I was able to do it. Sadly there's no video about it because it took me half an hour and was quite hard to film. After that I felt the need to waste even more time. You just saw the seat cushion that is included in the kit. The seat cushion isn't really visible in the end, but for some reason I felt the need to improve it a little. I do a lot of 3D designing and 3D printing for my models, but that's usual technical stuff I can design in Fusion 360. I'm not good at organic stuff like seat cushions. So I started to learn using Blender. Blender is the perfect program for organic stuff like seat cushions. It took me a lot of time to design a very basic seat cushion that's barely better than the original one, but I did it anyways, and I was quite satisfied with the end result. But I have to say that I wasted a lot of time on that I could have used otherwise. As you can see, I used the same weathering techniques on the seat itself that I used on the cockpit before. Then I also glued in the 3D decal seat belts. I used super glue for that, placed them to the side of the seat, and I also glued them to the seat cushion in natural orientation. After they were in place, I used my AK Interactive Dark Amber pin wash to dirty them up a little and make them look more realistic. Again, I started the blending process right after I applied the pin wash, so it has no time to dry in any unwanted spots and I only get a slight hint of the brown color on the seat belts. As you can see, I didn't place the seat into the cockpit yet. I will do this later. After the decals and the clear coat had quite some time to dry, I started the weathering process on the wing. Here you can see me using AK Interactive Engine Grime as a pin wash around the rivets I glued one by one in the video before this one. The engine grime enamel effect seems to contain way more pigment than my panel liner, so I had to do a lot more blending at this point. For the weapon base in the wing, I turned back to my black panel liner. Black seems to be the right color for me to simulate the residue and dirt that would be left after firing the guns for a long time. Also, the rivets here were a lot smaller than the ones on the upper part of the landing gear bay I just showed you, so it was nice to have a panel liner that flows a little better around all those details and rivets. And then I decided to also use the black panel liner on the rivets I just did earlier with the engine grime. For some reason I wasn't able to find the brush I usually use for that, so I had to use the brush that comes with the bottle. It's horrible, don't use it, just use another brush for that. After everything was blended together, I turned to my new favorite effect, the fresh oil effect by AK Interactive. I started to play around with this paint when I built the Tango Railway car, and I really like it. The slightly red-brown color looks pretty cool on green and bluish surfaces, but it also simulates fresh oil effects, so it stays glossy after it dried. This is quite a cool contrast on a matte surface. And since I like doing pin washes so much, I was quite happy that I had the opportunity to do a lot of that on the upper wing surface. The pin wash did a great job highlighting all those deep panel lines, but the sunken rivets all over the wing surface are quite shallow. I normally don't apply a gloss varnish before I do my panel line wash, or any other wash for that matter, so the paint gets a better grip on the surface, but it was way too easy to remove it from all those rivets. Because of that, I had to do like 3 or 4 passes with the panel liner to get to my desired result. When working on a matte varnish rather than on a gloss varnish, you also should work in smaller sections so you don't get any stains on your surface. After I blended everything together using my brush tipped and thinner, I also wiped down the surface using a single-use face cloth I found while grocery shopping. I prefer that now over normal kitchen paper towels since it's a lot less fuzzy. Then it was time for one last round of panel lining. And this time I only focused on the deepest recesses to make them even more pronounced. I started removing the excess paint right after I applied it, so I won't get any stains on my paint job. And then it was time for chipping. A lot of chipping. Again, I used my Vallejo metal color white aluminum for that, and a tiny brush that isn't in the best shape anymore, so I get a more random pattern when I paint the chips on. I went really heavy on the chipping on the upper wing surface. Maybe a little too heavy, but at this point I really like the look. The light and shiny aluminum paint creates a lot of contrast, and as I said before, I really like contrast in my model. Also, it worked as kind of an edge highlight on those panel lines and on the edges of the weapon base. So while you watch me paint even more chips on the wing surface, I have a short question for you. Do you prefer shorter, less detailed videos, or do you prefer longer, more detailed videos like this one? It would help me a lot if you could write a short comment about that, so I can create the videos you want to see. As you can see, I went heavier on the chipping on the left side of the wing. This is the area where the pilot will enter the cockpit, so there's a lot more movement going on. I also did some chipping on the inside part of the wing. This is the area where the wing and the fuselage would be bolted together normally. After the upper side was finished, I started to focus on the lower side of the wing. At first, I did a pin wash, as expected, with AK Interactive Dark Umber. Here I encountered the same problem I already faced on the upper wing surface. The pin wash looks great in those deeper panel lines, but not so much in all those small rivets all over the surface. So I decided to try something new. After the first panel line wash was blended together and mostly wiped away, I brought out my oil paints. For some reason I never really tried oil paints for weathering. I own a few Abteilung 502 oil paints that I barely touched in the past. I also own a lot of Old Holland oil paints. Those are artist quality oil paints that I normally use for canvas painting. I squeezed some oil paints from both brands on a piece of cardboard to compare them. You normally do this so the cardboard can soak up the excess oil. After a while I had quite a big oil stain around the Abteilung 502 oil paints, but a barely visible stain around my Old Holland paints since they contain a lot less oil and way more pigment. So I went with the artist paints for my oil wash or oil filter, however you wanna call it. As you can see, I put way too much paint on my model. Since the pigment density in those artist paints is so high, I could have used a lot less paint. After I dabbed some beige and black paint all over the underside of the wing, I started to use my brush dipped in odorless mineral spirits to blend it all together. And again, the single-use washcloth I got at the grocery store came in pretty handy to remove the excess paint. While I removed the excess paint, I made sure to always wipe in the direction of the airflow. I did this on the upper surface as well. This makes sure that you get some nice streaking effects like they would occur naturally on real aircraft. As you can see, I was quite aggressive while wiping away the excess paint. This wasn't a problem since my clear coat was hardened and the acrylic clear coat doesn't get attacked by the odorless mineral spirits. Also, I wanted to make sure that I remove most of the oil paint I just applied. Since this oil wash had a lot more pigment in it than the enamel panel liner I used before, it was fine to only do one round of oil wash on the underside of the wing. This was quite nice and overall quite a fast process. But of course I went in for another round with my dark umber panel liner by AK Interactive to make the deeper recesses and panel lines a little more pronounced so they are clearly visible. This is again more or less the same technique I already applied on the upper side of the wing as well. Right after I applied the paint, I went in with my brush dipped in thinner to remove the excess so I don't get any dark umber stains on my light blue-gray wing surface. As you can see, this pronounces the panel lines even more and gets me this high contrasty look I like so much in my models. As you can see, it's quite easy to stain those light blue-gray surfaces, so I had to do a lot of cleanup with my brush and my odorless mineral spirits. And of course, I also added some chipping on the underside of the wing and to the leading edge using my Vallejo metal color white aluminium. Then I started to focus on the landing gear bay on the underside of the wing. I started with painting all those small cables I added in the last video. And to my friends who already asked about that, yes, those are the cables that are completely invisible after the landing gear is placed in the landing gear bay. I used my AK Interactive 3rd generation acrylics at this point again. The yellow is the Sahara yellow and the black is the rubber black. That isn't really a black but like a very dark brown black mixture. That looks quite nice for rubber cables and also rubber tires, of course. And after the details were painted, it was of course time for another round of pin wash. I again used the dark umber pin wash for that and I did a pretty rough job here. It wasn't really necessary to focus too much on the landing gear bay and all those small details in there, since most of it will be invisible after the landing gear is in place. Speaking of the landing gear, here it is. It was also airbrushed in RLM02 and the metal part was painted with Vallejo metallic colors. As you can see, they flow really nice around the landing gear and make sure I get a nice and even coverage all over. I really prefer them over any other kind of acrylic metallic paint. The rims of the wheels were painted with RLM02 and the rubber part was hand painted with AK Interactive 3rd generation acrylic rubber black. There's a nice hard edge between the rim and the rubber part of those tires, so it was quite easy to brush paint them by hand. I normally also use this technique for road wheels on tanks. I barely ever mask off a rim with some masking tape. After that, you guessed it, time for another round of pin wash. Again, dark umber pin wash by AK Interactive. I try to use the same washes on areas that have the same color, so I get a more uniform look all over. The black part of the wheel received a dust wash. This light wash helps to highlight the tire profile and also makes those nice details on there clearly visible. It felt a little weird to focus more on the inside part of a tire than on the outside part, but since the landing gear will be in the retracted position, the outside part of those tires won't be visible, you only can see the inside part. After the tires were finished, I glued them to the landing gear struts using super glue and placed the whole landing gear assembly in the landing gear bay. I then started to weather the landing gear struts. Of course, I started out with a pin wash, followed by some nice blending using my mineral spirits. I spent quite some time on the landing gear assembly. As you can see, the wing will be placed with the upper side facing the floor, so the landing gears are the main detail I needed to focus on the lower side of the wing. That's also the reason why I spent quite some time in the last video to recreate all those details in the landing gear bay. And I feel kinda sad that most of them are now hidden with the landing gear in place. After I was finished with weathering the green parts on the landing gear struts, I started to work on the metallic parts. For that I used my AK interactive oil effects. The oil effects introduced another hint of color on the landing gear assembly. Also, the shiny look of the oil effects really works well with the metallic paint on the landing gear struts. It also makes the landing gear look a little leaky, and I like that as well. Here again, right after I applied the paint, I started to blend it together using some AK interactive odorless mineral spirits. And since the first layer of oil effects was quite faint, I added another layer to get the right amount of grime on there. And of course, after I was done with the oil effects on the landing gear assembly, I did another round of chipping, only focused on the landing gear struts. I used my Vallejo metal color again, but instead of the aluminum one, I used the steel one. And of course, after I was done with weathering and chipping, I went for another round of highlights on the landing gear assembly. For the green parts I used AK 13 Acrylics Grey Green. This was a perfect fit for the RLM02 color. I made sure to hit every nut and bolt on the landing gear and also on the tires to make them stand out and pop. And while you watch me paint all those tiny highlights, I would like to take a second to thank all of you guys for the amazing support over the last weeks. I get really excited about every new subscriber, and I'm blown away by the amount of views and comments I received on my last videos. So if you enjoyed this video so far, please leave a like and a comment, and of course subscribe to my channel. Thanks again for all the amazing support. Keep it up, and I try to do my best to get more videos out to you as soon as possible. Then it was finally time for the last few highlights on the wing. I glued the wingtip lights in place and painted the starboard side one with Tamiya clear green and the port side one with Tamiya clear red. After those were done, the wing assembly was finished and I was able to focus entirely on the fuselage. I started out by painting the missing details like this ladder. I airbrushed it with Tamiya white and then used Tamiya flat red to add a red stripe in the middle of it. There's also another detail I replaced on the fuselage underside after the last video. One of you guys mentioned in the comments that the ring antenna on the underside looks way too big. I looked up some pictures of that and of course you were right. I removed the original plastic one and bent myself one from a spare part of Photo Edge. That antenna looks now way thinner and way more in scale. And of course I also painted the tail wheel using AK Interactive Rubber Black. And then I did even more pin washing on the fuselage. Honestly, I'm not sure why I did that. I just learned that the oil wash takes care of the surface details way better on this model, so I should have gone with the oil wash at this point right away. But after I cleaned up my pin wash and noticed again that the black enamel paint does not stay very well in the small surface details, I used my black oil paints, dabbed it all over the surface and then again used mineral spirits to blend everything together. Again, I could have used a little less paint, but this amount was quite nice and gave me a nice and dark result with one go without looking too grimy after I cleaned everything up. And again, for the cleanup, the single-use washing clothes I got at the grocery store came in so handy. I'm really happy that I discovered those and I will use them a lot more in the future, I guess. I was also quite impressed by my AK Interactive Ultra Matte Varnish. This stuff was so resilient and stood up very well to a kinda rough treatment while I cleaned up the oil wash. I was quite happy that it kept my decals safe and I didn't tear up anything while removing the excess paint. And as I did on the wing as well, I added another round of pin wash, just focusing on the deepest surface details to make them pop again. I guess you know the drill by now. At this point, it also felt like I would work on two separate models. The wing as the first model and also the fuselage as another model. I mostly employed the same techniques on both parts, but since both were so detailed and so much work, it felt like two models at once. And since I'm able to learn from my own mistakes, I didn't start out with a pin wash on the lower side of the fuselage. Instead, I just put down some oil paint, blended everything together using the mineral spirits and then wiping most of it off. I also started to use way less paint than I used on the fuselage sides, and of course way less paint than I used on the wing itself, so I don't have to clean up that much excess paint. After I finally got all those large and flat surfaces out of the way, it was finally time to focus on the details, and I promise you there will be a lot of detail work from now on. I started out with some brush work around the machine gun mounts and around the area where the engine will be mounted later. While I was looking for more reference pictures of those areas, I noticed that there are a lot of details that I didn't add in the build video. So I started to fire up my computer and my 3D printer again and did a lot of 3D designing and printing that I will show you in a minute. For the brush painting, I again used my AK Interactive 3rd generation acrylic paints, mainly German Grey, Hull Red and Sahara Yellow for the cables, to get a little bit of color in there. After that I started to work on those nice 3D printed details I showed you in the last video. I made this piece by myself since the kit one was quite blunt and didn't have a lot of detail. Which of course is quite understandable. If you would build this kit like a normal person, those areas won't be visible in the end. As you can see, the pin wash alone already does a lot of the heavy lifting to show all those tiny details and all the rivets I placed there. But of course, after I was finished blending the enamel wash, I got in with my brush and some acrylic paint and started to highlight all those tiny rivets. And I also got to use my light dust wash again to highlight and weather all those dark gray areas around here. While I built the railway car from my first video, I already noticed that it's quite fun to highlight a dark gray or black surface with a light pin wash. Maybe I should try to build something black or dark gray in the future to make more use of this technique just for the fun of it. And I'm quite sure you expected it already. I did some metallic chipping on the machine gun mounts and on the surrounding areas. Then it was time for more highlights. To be fair, at this point I didn't have the patience to highlight all of those rivets one by one. Also, they are way too tiny for that. So this is more like a very precise dry brush, I guess. But again, this was so much fun. I really like the moment when all those tiny details start to become really bright and start to become really obvious. Since I spent a lot of time engineering them and creating them in the first place. Since it won't make much sense to add a lot of chipping in this area, I went for oil effects again. Early aircraft engines were quite leaky and I'm quite sure that there would be a lot of spilled oil all over the engine assembly. But of course I wasn't finished with the chipping yet. I added a few tiny chips to the sides of the fuselage and also to the leading edge of the horizontal and vertical stabilizers. Again, I went back to use my Vallejo Metal Colors white aluminum for that. I also made sure that I hit the edges around the canopy where the pilot would get in and out of the canopy. After I was finished in those areas, it was time to put the windscreen I painted earlier in place. Again, I used AK Interactive Crystal Magic Glue for that, since it dries crystal clear as the name suggests, and doesn't leave any traces behind. And of course, there was a little more weathering to do. I added some small chipping on the canopy frame, and also I used a dust wash to dirty up the clear parts of the windscreens a little. I put the dust wash on and then immediately went back in with my odorless mineral spirits to blend it. Before you do something like that, make sure to try out the products you're going to use on a leftover piece of clear sprue from your kit. The last thing you want to happen at this point is that your canopy gets foggy because you used an overly aggressive thinner on it. Then it was time to do a few exhaust stains. Unfortunately, this particular plane had those large black areas right behind the exhaust, so I needed to make those stains quite long to make them clearly visible. I built them up in layers using my airbrush. At first I sprayed a couple of coats of black panel liner through my airbrush, then I went for some AK Interactive engine grime, finished off by some AK Interactive oil effects. Combining those three together gave me some nice looking results with slight hints of color. After that I glued the rest of the canopy in place, and also I quickly weathered the yellow rudder. Since I had such a nice experience with oil paints so far, I again went for the oil paints. I used a light brown, mixed it with a lot of thinner and painted it all over the rudder. After some drying time, I of course cleaned up all the excess. Then it was time to focus on the transport racks. If you look close enough, you might be able to see that those aren't the transport racks I built in the last video. Unfortunately, I used the wrong kind of styrene for those, and the wood texture I added with my wire brush was way too faint after I primed those and started to paint over it. Luckily, I still had all my sketches, and I also was able to refer to my last video as a guide on how to build those transport racks. I like to use my Scale 75 artist acrylics to paint wood. I painted everything with a dark brown, and then I went in with some sandy and beige colors. Those artist acrylics by Scale 75 stay wet a lot longer than normal acrylic paints, so you're able to blend them together almost like oil paints, but with the benefit of drying a lot faster than oil paints do. After the first acrylic layer was done, I went in with my dark umber panel liner to get some shadows in there. Of course, I cleaned the excess off using mineral spirits. After that, I went in for kind of a dry brush, but in the direction of a wood with a light beige and sandy color, and I also did some edge highlighting with a nice and bright ivory color. I also redid the tarps I already made in the last video. The ones I made in the last video didn't fit the new transport racks perfectly, so it was easier to make a few new ones from green stuff. I painted those in grayish German uniform colors to make them look like racks made of old uniforms in kind of a German grey that were placed on the transport racks to keep the paint of the aircraft safe. For areas that are supposed to look like cloth or leather, I like to use a stippling technique to get a little visual texture on there. After the tarps were done, I went back in with a few thin glazes of different wood colors, oranges, and also a few blue-greens to create even more variation on the wooden surfaces. My idea was to create some old and weathered wood, and also to make every plank look a little bit different from the one next to each other, so it looked like they just used what they had at hand when they built the transport racks. The eyelets on the transport racks were painted using German grey. German grey is a nice base color in my opinion for dark steel surfaces. And do you remember those over 400 tiny nail heads I placed in the last video? I also had to do this all over again, and I painted them in a nice and bright steel color to make them pop on the wooden surface and make them really visible. I also dabbed some metallic paints on the eyelets to make them look even more like metal. After that, it was finally time for a few rust effects. I used AK Interactive Medium Rust for that, and I placed small drops of paint around all those nails and on the eyelets as well. Then I went back in with my enamel thinner to blend it all together and just leave a faint rust stain on the wood. I also used some streaking grime to introduce a few faint green areas on the lower parts of the transport racks. Now it was finally time to work on the engine. The engine also was primed black and then received a base coat of Vallejo metal color white aluminium all over. While priming, I made sure to get the black paint in all those deep recesses to get some really nice and dark shadows in there. But I was a little more careful when I sprayed the aluminium paint to preserve a few of those shadows in the deepest recesses. All areas that were supposed to be dark in the end received the base coat of Scale 75 Artist Acrylic in black. I really like this paint since it flows so nice and levels out great for an acrylic paint. It also stays wet a little longer than other acrylic paints. This ensures that I got a nice and even coverage over the dark parts. All the other details were painted with a combination of a few different AK Interactive 3rd generation acrylic colors, mainly Hull Red and some German grey and also some greenish tones for those cables. While looking for references, I was able to find a few different pictures of the engine and all of them had different cable colors, so I guess there's no real right or wrong answer for that. Just pick any color you like and a color that looks cool. My 3D printed prop shaft got base coated with another Vallejo metal color. In this case it's exhaust manifold. It's a nice and dark steel color. The parts that were made from cast metal are normally painted black. You've seen me do that earlier. But I also took some German grey and stippled it all over the surface to introduce a little more texture and make it look more interesting. At this point I also glued the front transport rack in place. This made it a lot easier to place the model on my table securely to paint all those details. Speaking of details, I already told you earlier that I noticed there are a lot of details missing on my model, even after I added a lot of them in the last video. So I had a good look at more reference pictures, did a little more of 3D designing and 3D printing, and I printed myself many cable mounts that went into different places near the engine. And of course I also started to add all those tiny cables made from copper wire, silver wire and lead wire in different sizes. 3D printing those tiny cable connectors spared me also the work of drilling a lot of small holes. In my opinion it also looks a lot nicer and more realistic than a cable just running into a hole in the plastic piece. At this point I thought that getting all those tiny cables into place might be the tedious job I had to do on this model. But oh boy, was I wrong. It got a lot worse in the end, I'll promise you that. It also would have been a great idea to base coat all those cables in black right after I placed them, since it was a lot harder to do that afterwards when all those cables were in place and I had to stick my brush between all those tiny cables. And as you can see, there are already a lot of tiny cables, and there will be more. But honestly, this was a lot of fun, taking a look at reference pictures and adding those cables one by one to achieve a more realistic look on this model. A few of those cables were clamped together by thin metallic clips. I recreated those using a thin strip of Tamiya masking tape that I wrapped around and painted silver later. I also noticed two wiring harnesses that I recreated from a cable. I removed the insulation and used the copper strings that were already twisted together. And of course I also added a few metal clamps, aka Tamiya tape, to them. And after all those cables were in place, I base coated them black with my Scale 75 Artist Acrylic paint. I might say that painting all those tiny cables took me even longer than recreating them in the first place. But again, this was a lot of fun. I picked a bunch of different colors like reddish grays and dark grays to get a little variety all over. For all the colors I used, I also mixed up a lighter version to paint in a few highlights on the cables as well. All the connectors and cable clamps were painted with a metallic color. I used AK Interactive Oily Steel for that, since it's a nice dark and steely look, and I again wanted to introduce a little more variety on the metallic colors. And of course I brought out my Vallejo metal color again to paint a few chips on the engine mount as well. This was the stage that always challenges me the most when I build a model. I'm so close to the finish, but there are still so many details that need to be done. And sometimes I maybe get a little bit impatient and I have to try to keep my focus real hard to put the same effort in all those details that I put in all the details I worked on before. But since I knew that you guys will have a good look at the model in the end, I did my best to keep my focus and put in the same effort in those final details I put in every other detail before. And I think I was quite successful with that. Now it was finally time to dirty up the way too clean looking engine. I used AK Interactive Engine Grime for that, then I thinned heavily with mineral spirits. Thinning it a lot made it flow a little better, so it acted like a pin wash all over the model and it flowed really nicely around all those details. But of course there was some cleanup that needed to be done, and I used a clean brush and the same enamel thinner for that. After the first round of engine grime, I also applied some more engine grime in a few areas to get an even darker and nicer result. And for the dark greyish black areas on the engine, I again used my dust wash to make them pop and highlight all those small details on there. As you can see, the dust wash flowed all over the surface, so I had to do a little more cleanup. But I started again right after I applied the paint, so this wasn't too bad. After all those enamel effects were cleaned up, I cut out the oil effects again and placed a few drops of fresh engine oil all over the engine. Well, a few drops might be an understatement. I put a lot of engine oil on it. I heard that there's a saying about warbird mode engines that if they don't leak, the oil is empty, so I placed a lot of oil all over the engine. And then I started painting the exhausts. I used AK Interactive 3rd Gen German Grey as a base coat for the exhausts. I said before, this is a nice base coat for a dark and steely color, and then I was able to work over it with a few rust washes. The first layer of rust was done with Rust Streaks by AK Interactive. I blended it all over the surface, and while the surface was still wet from the enamel thinner, I dabbed some AK Interactive medium rust deposits all over to get a little variety in paint. I then also went in back again with the Rust Streaks to tone the bright orange down a little. And since I was under the impression that you haven't seen enough footage of me highlighting small nuts and bolts, here's a little more footage of that. And of course I painted a little bit of chipping on the fan wheel as well. After that it was finally time to fix the pilot seat in place. Now it was also time to glue the missing seat belts in place. And the right one was placed normally on the seat, but for the left one I had planned something else. I've seen a video about the FW-190 replica that's still flying, and in that video the seatbelt flaps on the outside while the engine's already running. I liked the detail of the seatbelt hanging to the outside so much that I decided to recreate it on my model. And as I did before on the lower seat belts, I also used some dark umber to weather them a little. Let's now build an antenna. I used thin wire and a drill bit to recreate two small springs that were used to tension the antenna wire between the mounting points. And I glued in a thin piece of 0.1mm copper wire for the antenna itself. This antenna assembly then got super glued to two tiny holes I drilled into both the attachment points. After the glue was dried, I was able to shape the copper wire a little more to recreate the sagged look of the antenna wire. Of course, the antenna also got painted then. I then also glued the other transport rack in place. At this point I also took a few quick pictures of the engine assembly and the forward part of the fuselage and posted them to my YouTube community page to get your guys' opinions. Then I brought out the green stuff again to create a small tarp that fits over the windscreen on the front. I placed it there since I wanted to flip open the engine panel that you will see in a moment, and I've seen a few pictures where they place the rack over the windscreen so the windscreen doesn't get scratched up when this engine panel is flipped open. And of course, at this moment I glued this panel in place as well. At this point it came to my mind that it wouldn't be safe to transport an aircraft on a railway car without securing it in place to the transport rack, so I created a small strap for that. Sadly, cool looking ratchet straps weren't a thing in World War II, so I designed and 3D printed those clamp buckles that I observed in reference pictures. I also bent two hooks out of thin copper wire and I cut a small piece of Tamiya tape to use it as the strap itself. And now I have to pat myself on the back. I was able to design and print those buckles in such a way that I was able to slide the tape right through them in the right spots and almost close to the tape like it would be done on the real ones. This is kind of hard to see in the end and it may be a totally unnecessary detail. but it was so much fun recreating those straps in such a way that I almost went ahead and built a few more of them just for the fun of it. For some reason it seems to be way harder to put that strap into place and film that than building the strap itself, so unfortunately there isn't any footage I can show you about that because everything was so blurry. After the strap was in place, I used my black paint to base coat it, and then I used a bunch of different brown and beige and sandy colors to recreate the canvas effect on the strap. I also used German grey for the metallic parts of the transport rack, and I used the metallic color on the buckle itself. The strap also received a few edge highlights with an ivory color to make it pop real good against the darker background. This is one of my favorite details on this build, and I wanted to make sure that it will be clearly visible in the end. Speaking of the end, at this point all that was left to do was to put the wing onto its transport racks. That was done without any glue, so I can turn it around and observe it from both sides. And now I'm finally able to present you the finished wing assembly and also the finished fuselage assembly. But fear not, this isn't the end of this video. Before I show you a lot more of cool detail work, I'd like to take again a second to thank all of you guys for the amazing support, and I also wanted to remind you again to please subscribe to my channel, leave a like and leave a comment, since this would help me a lot. At this point I thought to myself that it would be way too easy to just glue the transport rack with the fuselage to the railway car I built in the first video. So I designed and 3D printed a few more details that I would like to show you now. Remember when I told you earlier that adding all those small wires to the engine wasn't the most tedious part of this build? We get there now. I designed and 3D printed a few parts to recreate the most realistic way of securing those transport racks to the railway car. I cut a piece of small chain that I found in my modeling supplies to the right length, and then I 3D printed an eyelet and also a shackle. I was able to fix the tiny chain with an even smaller bolt to the shackle I 3D printed before. I also was able to put on a very small nut on the other end of the bolt, and I secured it in place with super glue. I also designed and 3D printed a turnbuckle. The outer pieces were attached to the chains using those small bolts and those small nuts again, and the middle part was glued in later. I also secured another piece of chain with the opposite end of the turnbuckle to the transport rack itself. I then glued in the middle piece and also glued the eyelet you saw in the beginning to the railway car. I had to be very careful since those tiny 3D printed parts broke pretty easily and I used a lot of those. It also took me way more time than it should have. I spent about 2 hours on each of those chains. And to be honest, those were pretty nerve-wracking 2 hours, and I was quite happy when I was finished. Those tiny chains, the turnbuckles and also the strap that secures the fuselage to the transport rack might be my favorite details about this build. I really like the paint job on the aircraft, but those tiny details were so worth the time I spent recreating them, and I would do it every time again. And I really would love to hear your opinion about those pieces, so please let me know down in the comments. I also added a few chains to the transport rack at the front of the aircraft fuselage. Those aren't secured yet to the railway car since I plan to do something else with them when this model is placed in the diorama. For those I again cut off a piece of chain and secured it to the transport rack using one of those small 3D printed shackles. At this point I also placed the stand under the prop shaft that I made in the last video. Then it was finally time for the last few brush strokes. Again, surprisingly I used my black scale 75 artist acrylic paint to base coat all those chains and 3D printed details I just added. After I painted everything black, I did another base coat of German grey to the chains and to the eyelets that are mounted to the railway car. For the turnbuckles I used a bunch of white and light grey paints. Turnbuckles were zinc plated back then and still are, and zinc plated finishes develop a few yeah, sort of tiny white dots all over the surface when they start to corrode. So I base coated them in a light gray, and then I stippled a few lighter grays and whites all over it. And those colors also help to highlight those small turnbuckles that I like so much, and I was quite happy to make them a little more visible on the end result. And after the German gray was dry on the chains itself and also on the eyelets, I more or less dry brushed a little bit of silver paint over the edges to make them stand out a little more and to give them a little shine. And as you probably figured out by now, I don't like it when things are too shiny, so I brought back out my AK Interactive enamel rust paints and I put a few rust effects over the chains to make them look a little more rusted out and to make them look a little bit dirty. And of course, the rust wash also got blended right after the application, so it's not too hard of a contrast. And at this point we are almost finished. As I said before, it would be great if you could leave a comment about how you like such long and detailed videos. Would you prefer shorter videos with less detail, or do you like this long format? Editing this and making the voiceover was quite a challenge for me, maybe more of a challenge than building the model itself, but I had a lot of fun doing it. But to be honest, at this point I'm quite happy that we are almost finished, since my voice isn't the best anymore. I told you before that I already started working on the diorama, and at this point I'm quite sure that you will receive another video this year to bring this project to an end, and I'm really looking forward to that. But for now, let's take a look at the last detail. I already told you that early engines were quite leaky, so I added a nice and big oil stain to the wood of the railway car under the engine. When you take a look at the pictures of the finished model in the end of this video, or if you follow the link to my Google Drive with even more pictures, you should keep an eye out for this oil stain. It's clearly visible since it's shiny, and in my opinion it's also another one of those details that aren't really visible at first or at first glance, but look pretty damn cool if you spot them. And here we finally have our end result. I had so much fun building and painting this model. I had even more fun doing this video for you guys, and I hope you enjoyed it as well. So please leave a like, leave a comment, subscribe to my channel, take a look at the high quality pictures in my Google Drive, the link is in the video description, and I hope to see you all in the next video. Take care.